Now, I know I've made it no secret that I think Disney's been going in the wrong direction for the past few years. In fact, I'd say that with only a few exceptions, they've been on the wrong track for pretty much 10 years at this point. And I've also been quick to blame Pixar's influence for this, saying that it's their mature style of storytelling that's caused Disney to fall off the rails. However, while I do stand by everything I've said about Pixar, I do believe another problem Disney's been suffering from is trying too hard to be modern or to modernize their stories. And as I mentioned in my very first video of the Pixar Problem series, which you can find a link in the description to, it almost feels as if they're ashamed of their roots and are going out of their way to bury them as much as possible. But what they don't seem to understand is even if those older movies are in some ways a bit dated, on the whole, they'll still be applicable hundreds of years from now because they have a very timeless feel and quality to them. It's like no matter where or when you watch those movies, you'll be able to enjoy them to their fullest extent. But the way they do their movies now, they run the risk of it feeling explicitly stuck to one time and place in only a few years, and on a couple of occasions have even had their movies be labeled as dated before they even came out. Now, you're probably wondering, okay, maybe all of that is true, but what does this have to do with The Princess and the Pauper? Simply this. I'm not faulting Disney for wanting to modernize their stories one bit. The 40s, 50s, and 60s, and even the 80s and 90s were different from today, and there should be some changes throughout the decades. The problem is that they're trying too hard in this regard. For example, Raya and the Last Dragon is supposed to take place in ancient China, and they're making fun of dad jokes and referring to school projects. Contrast this with Sleeping Beauty. It's specifically stated to take place in the 14th century, and it feels like it. Sure, there's plenty of humor, but nothing specific to the 1950s that would break the illusion or indicate that's when it was made. But I know to that some would probably say to me, yes, but you just said you don't blame Disney for wanting to modernize their stories. And if they do, then isn't some modern humor going to come through? And that's where the subject of this video comes in. Because you see, there is a way to modernize old stories while also keeping the illusion intact and not have to inject any actual modern humor into the story at all. Okay, so now that that whole speech is out of the way, and if you're still here, thank you very much for sitting through all of that. The Princess and the Pauper is a 2004 direct-to-video movie, obviously based on the book The Prince and the Pauper by Mark Twain. And if you ask me, it may just be the best Disney princess movie that Disney never made. And it's certainly one Disney could take a lot of pointers from when it comes to trying to modernize their stories while staying true to what their movies always were. But to get away from Disney and into the movie itself, the story obviously tells of a princess and a pauper who are identical apart from their hair color. And after the princess is kidnapped, the pauper must pretend to be the princess in order to stop the royal advisor's evil plans. You've also got plenty of talking animals, rich kings who love disguises, and a royal tutor who's a lot more than he appears to be. Now, from this point on, there will be major spoilers ahead, so if you'd rather check out this movie for yourself first, you should probably click off the video now. This will be your only warning. Now, I know it's probably a little weird hearing a grown man talking about an obscure princess movie like this, but when you've seen as many movies as I have, you'll find that you can find hidden gems in the most unlikely of places, and this is certainly one of them. Because the thing is, this movie gets absolutely everything right. There are talking animals, but they're never annoying and are just as important to the plot as the human characters. Seriously, there are many times that the story would have gone in a very different direction had it not been for their actions. Every single character is strong. There's not a single weak one among them, and it's never at another character's expense either. They all get multiple times to have their moment, and boy or girl, human or animal, prove how capable, smart, brave, resourceful, and self-reliant they are. And nobody is anybody else's love interest either. They're all on equal footing and get time to endear themselves to the audience. And as anybody who's seen this movie will tell you, they very much succeeded in that regard. And the comedy is also perfectly on point without ever once having to resort to cringe comedy. Like the scene with that poor baker's pies, or the part where they think the princess's cat is a ghost. This movie manages to be genuinely funny in a way that can make even adults chuckle. And the soundtrack is simply great. They talk at length about how great Erica's singing is, but I say the whole cast knocks it out of the park. I mean, I don't know who wrote the songs for this movie, but it's something that would easily make the likes of Alan Menken very proud, I'm telling you. And of course, there's the villain. The Queen's royal advisor, known simply as Preminger, wants to be king and will resort to any means necessary to get that crown on his head. Voiced to perfection by Martin Short, easily the most famous person in the cast, this guy is Jafar and Scar rolled into one with a dash of Ursula's persuasive charisma and Gaston's vanity for good measure, and it's absolutely glorious to behold. No joke, Preminger could have easily been a villain from the Disney Renaissance, and if you ask me, is the type of character they are sorely missing today. Because not only is he a blast to watch, gets a great villain song, and has one heck of an end goal, but he's also very intelligent, good at improvising, and an extremely credible threat. Because the amount of times he comes so close to winning is honestly scary. And that's even with the fact that he has to constantly change his plans because of the other character's actions. In the end, he's literally seconds away from victory, and had it not been for the combined efforts of all the heroes, he may very well have walked away as king. And even his two henchmen, who are quite possibly the dumbest people on earth, manage to be rather funny, and never once is their stupidity overdone. Seriously, how can you not laugh at this? They seriously thought that was going to fool him? But when the chips are down, they can also carry out their orders quite well. And that's what helps make Preminger so scary. He may be fun to watch, but when I said he'd do anything to accomplish his goals, I mean he'll do anything. When he decides he has no other recourse, he chooses to have two people, one of whom is the princess he's supposed to be serving, crushed to death without a second thought, and then drowned as well in case that doesn't finish them off. And had it not been for the timely intervention of a horse and cat, it would have worked. He played his cards so well that he was able to cover up his involvement completely, worked the whole situation to his advantage, and by the end of his cover story, only one person, who happens to be an outsider, can see through his ruse. And then there's that evil laugh he gives right before the wedding is about to start. It's enough to send shivers down your spine and let you know right then that the queen is headed for trouble and that the whole kingdom may just be doomed. All from one little laugh. Seriously, Disney, take notes. But what's really notable is this movie manages to juggle so many characters and does them all justice. I was even going to write a list for how well each one of them was done individually, but I don't want this video to be 3 hours long. So all I can really say is, if you're that curious, just go watch the movie for yourself. You'll see what I'm talking about. But other than that, it also manages to take elements that would sound ridiculous on paper and translates it perfectly on screen. There's literally a cat whose whole problem is that he barks and acts like a dog, and it works. There's also a dog who's little more than a bully and obsessed with his gold tooth, and it works. And finally, Preminger is defeated by his horse. When have you ever seen that? A villain defeated by his own horse? And yet, in context, it's the perfect way to end it. Especially because you're expecting this big chase between him, Julian, and Dominic before Elve finally decides he's had enough of his boss's behavior and cuts it short, sending him flying right into his own wedding cake. Like I said, it makes more sense in context, but it's still brilliant at that. And that's another thing. This movie manages to blend the comedy into a pretty serious story very well. I mean, it's a pretty funny movie, but when it gets serious. The stakes are real. The heroes know what they're facing if they fail, and it's not afraid to go to some darker places either, such as depicting poverty, indentured servitude, and political marriages, in addition to other things. And yet, it still manages to have a relatively light tone, which I feel only speaks to how well this movie was handled. And to say it one last time, all the characters are done perfectly, with any one of them, girl or boy, animal or human, being able to serve as a good role model for the little ones. In fact, after seeing a movie like this, I honestly wish this is how royals behaved in real life. But I guess that's the whole point, really. To show the good we could do if it weren't for people like Preminger. But I'm getting off topic here. Alright, so to simplify everything I just said, The Princess and the Pauper is the perfect example of how to modernize a 100-year-old story while staying true to it and maintaining a timeless feel. Because the movie's only described as taking place in a faraway kingdom long ago, and that's exactly how it feels. This kingdom could be anywhere at any time, and nowhere is that illusion even remotely broken. Not even because the girls are strong, and not damsels in distress. Really, the feeling of authenticity is another thing that's rather incredible. And when you take all of that into account, Disney really has no leg to stand on making their movies the way they do. As this movie proves, there are ways of updating stories without uprooting everything that made them enjoyable and universal in the first place. And listen, I don't hate Disney. Far from it, actually. I'm just trying to point out that their attempts at modernization seem to mostly boil down to making the characters as awkward as possible and throwing in a ton of out of place and uncomfortable humor at you. While The Princess and the Pauper, by contrast, managed to arguably modernize its story much better without ever having to resort to any of that. In all honesty, if any of the people working at Disney are watching this video, which I know is not very likely, please watch this movie and take some notes on it. Trust me, you will see what I'm talking about here. And I know The Princess and the Pauper doesn't have any huge morals or themes in it, but you gotta keep in mind this is a kid's movie. Children don't like being preached to, and if you ask me, sometimes people are more likely to learn from something if it isn't trying to shove some life-changing lesson down their throats, which is something that Disney and Pixar seem to have forgotten. Okay, that pretty much wraps everything up. And listen, I know there are going to be some people who will say that The Princess and the Pauper isn't nearly as good as I'm saying it is, or that I'm hyping it up too much. But please understand that even though I obviously have a lot of love for this movie, I'm not trying to say it's a masterpiece or the greatest movie of all time. I'm just saying that it gets everything right that modern Disney seems to be getting wrong, and that maybe they could learn a few things from it. But if you completely disagree with me on that, that's fine. And speaking of which, now it's your turn to tell me. Do you think The Princess and the Pauper is an underrated gem and everything modern Disney should be? Or do you think I'm giving it way too much credit and that Disney's been doing just fine? Please feel free to discuss your feelings in the comments below. And thank you all for watching. I always greatly appreciate it, and I hope to see you all next time.